Kenneth Auchenberg. Welcome to the work item.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting. I've been really looking forward to this.
I know it's, the last time we actually chatted, I think in a meeting was back when you were working in DevDiv or developer division for the uninitiated. It's been a while.
It has been a minute, yeah. Like when we were both at Microsoft in DivDiv, like the very special place that manages together all the tool builders of the world to do epic stuff. Yeah, I definitely miss parts of it, DivDiv, that's for sure.
So what are you up to these days? If you're not in DevDiv anymore, I'm sure you've been adventuring. So what's that adventuring like?
Yeah, like these days, I'm actually taking a bit of a break. I left Stripe a few months back, earlier this summer, and very intentionally is trying to like change gears a little. I think coming out of like doing 4+ years at a company like Stripe and other things, I realized it was time for me to take a little break. So these days, I'm mostly focused on advisory, helping some of my portfolio companies I've invested in, really focusing on developer tools, and also just like taking the time, like, it's the end of the year, that kind of thing, to get into a different pace. But also, I have a few hypotheses of where developer tools might be going in the future. I just want to spend some time building out a conviction.
So actually, you talk about developer tools, and I noticed kind of a trend in your career, and that you kind of try to stick to things that deal with developer tools and developer experiences. Why is that?
Yeah, like I think it's a really good question. I think I kind of accidentally walked into the developer tools kind of niche. I think early on in my career, I probably hadn't like anticipated I would build stuff for developers, but having a background of being a developer myself and really just like caring about like building tools, it's kind of just been a natural kind of like gravity pull, I would say, how I ended up thinking about tools for developers. And at Stripe, I was like on a different level of abstraction, in the sense that I focus on developer experience for like an API platform. But I think like career is all about like finding your niche and something you're passionate about. And to me, that just had turned out to be developers. And I did some community building. I've done products. I've done engineering, and product is really like kind of like what I find is very meaningful.
So you were a product manager in developer tools.
Yes, I kind of like my short career. If we wanna open that can of worms, is that I started like coding when I was like in my early teenage years, and I started like programming, asking a lot of questions, a lot of online for. Back then, I was doing a lot of like VB and Visual Basic and VB.net and those kind of things. And I ended up getting a part-time job offer when I was 16 for like a local startup in Denmark. They're like, hey, you're asking a lot of interesting questions. Do you want to come here and try to learn how to program? So I started like programming, getting paid like for that when I was 16. And then that led into me getting like a full-time position. And then I went from one startup to another. So it's really been about like just me being curious and learning how to do things and glue stuff together and understand systems. So I think a natural progression for me, it was like kind of doing like roughly a decade of engineering, building various teams and startups. When I was based in Denmark, really focused on like front end engineering, bit of engineering management, that kind of thing, and then jumping to the product side. And that was really when I joined like officially. I became like a PM when I joined Microsoft. I kind of been doing producty kind of work in some places I worked before, but at Microsoft, that was kind of like, you are now officially a PM, and what the heck is that, right? It was kind of a very interesting kind of journey.
And especially because if I think about, developer tools, developer experience, there's this kind of, misconception that, oh, they're engineers, they'll figure it out. Like, no matter how complex it is, just throw some buttons on the screen and give them a code. Like, you're a product manager. That seems a little bit counterintuitive to a developer tool or developer experience. Maybe you can walk me through what's the value of a product manager when your audience is developers. Can developers build it themselves and figure out what they need?
Yeah, like I do think that's like a general kind of industry question. Also very curious to hear your take, as I understand you're also doing a very similar thing these days, right? I definitely think like in general in our industry we're seeing PMs kind of getting a bad rep, and we all seen like the videos of like whoever at the pool or whatever, and people just love to like talk badmouth PMs. But I do think like there's a lot of value in great product management, so like you helping your team really aligning like the strategy and where you're going, you really aggregating like the insights from your customers. And like I'm probably like biased towards like I believe PMs working on developer shaped products needs to be have a high technical background and also be able to build themselves. I definitely think a failure mode is to kind of hire a consumer classic B2B PM on a platform developer shaped product. That usually doesn't end well. So I do think you inherently have to understand who your customers are and be building for those. But I think like there's just a lot of value in terms of like you focusing on the high level you run, you being like a quarter or two ahead of the team and can kind of help the team see around corners. But definitely, I do think like kind of like being a PM on technically shaped products is also a bit of like a moldable kind of role. Some days you are helping the team talking to customers, others you focus on company strategy, other times you might be writing samples. I think that's kind of the fun of it, that you can kind of do a bit of everything. But I think it really depends on what kind of product culture you have, what kind of engineering culture you have, whether you actually need PMs or not. I think a lot of companies, particularly in the early stage, are very successful without PMs. And then, yeah, so I guess the question depends, but also depends on what kind of product you're building, right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there's every once, a few months, you see a thread on Hacker News popping up. It's like, I wish we did not have PMs. Engineers can move so much faster if we don't have PMs. It's like, will you though? I don't know. It's kind of a.
It's interesting. Like I would say, like I mean, like for my time at Microsoft was an interesting one. I originally joined to work as a PMO. I say like at Microsoft, kind of like the running joke is that everyone were program managers back then, right? And like I think that there's this blog post, the lost souls of program managers at Microsoft, because like a manager could mean anything. It could mean that you are the person updating tickets. It could mean that you're the architect on the team. It's kind of like very like ambiguous role where you could do whatever you wanted under the guide of being a PM. So my experience at Microsoft was interesting. That's kind of like my official kind of like introduction to product management. And I think I saw like a very like archetype of like you were being like the product or the project manager. You're updating the tickets, you're facilitating that kind of process where product is really driven by like the principal director level strategies coming from the top down. And then I saw other teams that is really focused on like kind of a new kind of like, I would say like a modern kind of product manager, really talking to the customers, aggregating that demand, running the social media account. So I saw like a big spread, and it's my understanding that also the program manager role has changed at Microsoft. And I believe it's been split out, but you tell me.
Yeah, they finally came to terms with exactly the same dilemma as you talked about, which is when you try to hire people into the role, it becomes very confusing. We're like, what exactly is a program manager? Because like depending on which team you ask, they're all going to have different ideas. And now we have a separate program manager and product manager track. So
got it. Okay. That makes sense. So I would say like from like the VS Code team I was working on for quite a few years, being like we had like a very small team. The team was like sub 25 people, one designer, two PMs on the team. Back then, I actually spent a lot of time doing the operational work. What we like in other companies, you would say product ops, but like I was doing everything from like talking to partners, talking to customers, grooming GitHub issues. Back then, we had like thousands of GitHub issues every single day until we built some tooling. I was running the social media account. I was doing a bit of everything. But more importantly, I was trying to like just aggregate information for the team and trying to run ahead, because I actually think like the VS Code team is probably one of the most, at least were back then, one of the most really product obsessed teams, where there's a really high like product ownership on an engineering IC level, where people just run with things, where I could help like seeing around corners, etc. And I think just projecting forward, when I joined Stripe back in 2019, I was actually the first PM working on our developer platform. Stripe didn't have a lot of PMs back then. I think Stripe has had like a really strong product engineering culture. I think traditionally we've kind of been talking about back engineers, front end engineers, that kind of thing, where in Stripe you were like a product engineer. You work on a particular product and you own the full stack and you drive like functionality through where it's needed. The Stripe tradition has had a really strong product engineering culture and also has it to this current day. But where we started having demands or needs for PMs was really start to like Stripe was becoming so big that it actually took a lot of focus away from the team to build functionality. That you need people dedicated to kind of like actually being intentional about the strategy. Also, as you kind of go from one product to a portfolio product to running a platform, kind of the scope kind of changes, and like you have to be much more intentional in your decision making, etc. So that was some of the things I was trying to help the team back then on getting all that into place. And throughout the years, we managed to hire a lot of great PMs and actually build out, like I would say, a very small but strong technical product management function at Stripe.
And you mentioned DevDiv and their aspirations for PM, and I think, especially at Microsoft, I think DevDiv was kind of the pinnacle of what great PMs should be doing in a technical space. Like that has always been the case. If you look at like the work that you've been doing around VS Code, you look at what folks have done around like the Azure SDK, there is just so much of this in-depth technical product specific work that I think a lot of times from outside Microsoft is not really seen, because you can think of like, oh yeah, engineers, they throw APIs together. Like, what's hard about putting an SDK, right? Yeah, but like if your customers don't really know how to intuitively use it, and you build a terrible developer experience, like somebody needs to corral that.
Yeah, and also somebody needs to establish, like I think, like a big failure mode I see for a lot of engineering teams is like really just lack of good customer feedback loops. It's like kind of like what I'm seeing a lot is that a highly functioning engineering team will be highly functional on the engineering side, that they will finish something, they'll finish the tickets, they'll do the release, and then nothing, right? Customers don't know the functionality has shipped. There hasn't been a push. There's no feedback loop established. The team does not know how many people have adopted the product, etc. So I think that that's kind of like where like just the product mindset is, that we haven't shipped something until it's in the hands of our customers. They know how to use it. We've written the documentation, etc. So that's kind of like a very common failure mode where I think a PM can kind of come in and help establish those feedback loops. But I actually don't think like, I think like it's all about leverage. How can you enable a culture on the team where everyone wants to talk to customers, want to like really be obsessed about whether this feature has been adopted, etc. This product has been adopted, and then it kind of just comes in naturally. So it's about like it cannot be like just the PM's responsibility to talk to customers, understand where we're going. It has to be like the team's responsibility regardless of function. At least that's kind of how I'm trying to frame it. And that's what we've been trying to do at Stripe for the past many years. Really, it's just like talking about like building a product experience. Like we had this mantra of like building a surprisingly great experience, in the sense that we have like the discerning developers that really have a high bar for what a great developer experience is like. And we had to like try to enjoy. Our aspiration was to try to engineer these kind of surprisingly great moments. For example, if you use the Stripe API and you have a typo in one of the API parameters, we will spell check it for you, and we will like return that in the error response. Hey, did you mean this, right? That's some of the small moments we try to engineer into the product that a developer didn't expect. Or I think another like very common example is that you go to Stripe's documentation and all the sample codes in the docs are actually having your API key as a part of like the code, so you can just copy paste it and run it. Small things like that where you're having that attention to detail that the developer wouldn't expect.
And you think it's small, but it makes a huge difference for developers. Like me not having to copy an API key over and over again, or me misspelling, some function, and then my IDE telling me is like, oh, here's what you meant. Guaranteed that's what you meant. Like, these little delighters add a lot of value when combined.
Yeah, like I definitely think like kind of like, what is it, like a little big detail, that old block of like really like great UI. I definitely think like little big details kind of compounds over time in terms of that craftsmanship and that attention to detail. Is that if developers can kind of see that, oh, you have actually been thinking two steps ahead of me here, and also like I'm delighted and I have another delight, that kind of compounds on the satisfaction. But I also think it reinforces the product culture where like I remember some of my early days at Stripe where like I was like, one of my favorite stories, like Patrick, one of the Stripe co-founders, like he literally would ping me at like 11 p.m. on some of the product we were shipping, and we were discussing like should I use a dash or M dash in the documentation? Is this comma Oxford comma or not? Because we really rigorous about like the attention to detail. So I definitely learned a lot about how to use M dashes from Patrick.
Yeah. The little details. Yeah. And it's, I think ultimately, these are kind of the death by 1,000 paper cuts is a thing in developer tools, because something not working here, something not working there, something becoming problematic in the debugging experience, and then spilling over into the fact that when deployed, the same thing breaks that could have been caught in debugging. Like it like you said, it compounds. And the magic word that you kind of mentioned is craftsmanship. And I think this is something that is deeply lacking oftentimes when folks think about APIs or SDKs or any kind of developer tooling. It's that concept of proper craftsmanship, which translates to like caring deeply about those little details.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of people who don't work on like the abstractions or the experiences provided to developers just think, oh, you just scaffold like an API off an open API spec, and then you're good to go, right? And then you turn up with like a terrible kind of like documentation that no one wants to use. You end up with like some code gen SDKs that doesn't feel right, doesn't have like the native language features, etc. So to me, it's really about like putting yourself in the shoe of like the developer. And I am a developer by heart. I love writing code. So it's really about like emphasizing with kind of like uh, other programmers, like what would you expect with this kind of abstraction, and being intentional about like the abstraction ladder. And another thing I think that is really interesting is like think about like abstractions with it, like notion of like, I would say like, is it like power and complexity, and like kind of have a curve over time, right? In terms of like having that careful wheel of like complexity as you kind of unlock more power to people. I think that there's a lot of like abstractions that are really, how should I put this, that have a really convenient kind of easy, simple to interface. But as soon as you need a bit more power, then you kind of have to escape all that really nicely wrapping, and then you end up being on your own. I think like a good example is something like was it like React scripts when you're building an app. It's really nice. It's kind of as long as you're on a golden path. And then the moment you have to press eject, like you're kind of on your own. You have all the complexity, you have all the power. So I think like a lot of people that I know that are building great developers, they really think about that relationship and power and complexity, and how you can enable the kind of right escape hatches over time. And I think there's definitely a lot of intentional thinking that comes into like great developer products. And tying it back to DivDiv, I think one of the things I really like appreciated about DivDiv is that it's a really unique collection of like people and perspective that really been thinking a lot about these problems. But also there's an at Microsoft in particular, I think there's an inherent just understanding of platforms, what it means to run a platform, think about extensibility, etc. Which actually like is something I probably always taken for granted with some of the things I worked on, some of the open source work I've been doing. But in my experience, it's actually it's kind of like a niche kind of perspective. Not a lot of people intuitively get like why you want a platform, why you want to unlock that like ecosystem on top of you. A lot of companies are really focused on like we control every single pixel. We build the product experiences. Why would I have these third parties interfering with my product work, etc.? So I definitely think like Microsoft, like it's kind of the joke with Microsoft is also, I can say that now, I'm not an employee, that Microsoft also tends to kind of like make everything into a platform, right? It's like we built a chat and then it's suddenly a platform with apps, etc., that no one is using, right? So I definitely think like it's all about that balance, but that's probably one of the main things. And spending some time at Microsoft, I really appreciated that, in terms of like that there's inherent understanding of platform thinking.
And what also kind of this reminds me of is kind of the difference between proper product teams and feature teams. And the distinction there is very subtle, and that what you just described is like somebody thinking end to end about how this translates into the developer experience, how the documentation plays with it, how our API is actually being consumed by the developers, like is it in the CI job or in the local machine, versus feature teams that kind of throw things over the wall and think like, oh, one of them will stick. You know, oh, we added this API. They'll use it. Whatever. Fine. Another API on top of that. And then 3 years later, you're like, oh, we need to scrap half of those APIs completely because none of them actually are needed in the current architecture, breaking everybody else. And it's the subtle but important difference that exists in every single developer organization. And I think like one of the developer organizations can fall into one or the other.
Yeah, 100%, right? Like it's like I think for a lot of for a lot of products, kind of like the developer aspect is kind of like this bolt-on thing on the side. It's like we have actually the main product, and by the way, we have this developer platform with the API. It might be helping some of our partners, but we really care about the main thing because that's what we're selling to our enterprises. So I definitely think like you can easily end up in where like the developer experience is kind of an afterthought, or the API platform is an afterthought. I think there's a lot of like tactical things you can do in terms of like maybe the platform you're building should be the same internally and externally to make sure there's actually dog like being consumed, all these things, right? But definitely I'm seeing that yeah, it's definitely can be an afterthought, but also if you as a team, you're only being measured on shipping this functionality, how much revenue are you closing, and not like does people actually like using your product, like how is the full end-to-end experience. And that's also some of the things that I spent some time when I'm in particular at Stripe working on, like how do you measure great developer experience, how do you think about metrics, how do you think about integration experience versus developer experience, all these kind of things. Yeah, they definitely spent a lot of time there. And as we were kind of building out the various teams, when I joined Stripe, we didn't have an SDK team. We had one engineer on a part-time basis writing these things by hand, and then we kind of like were putting systems and scaling out functions, right? So
In your context, because you came in at a time when that pattern needed to be established, like the practice of product collaborating with engineering in a way that kind of builds this end-to-end great developer experience, what were your kind of biggest lessons learned in putting it together? Because to me, as an outsider, this seems like a pretty monumental shift that needs to happen in an organization, right? And like coming in to an engineering team and telling them, oh, by the way, like you need to do things differently now. That, depending on how you want to swing that hammer, things can go differently. So how did they go for you?
like I didn't say like yes, I agree with you in the sense that I think it's a journey a lot of organizations are going through in terms of like just winging it, listening to the loudest customer, kind of getting over the hurdle. You have one successful product, now you're on the portfolio. Maybe you want to embrace on like the platform journey. But I even think like when is that moment when you need to introduce product management? To me, it's about like managing complexity when you have a lot of like parallel work streams that you can kind of like get a PM to start like navigating that. I would say like I have not figured out a recipe or when it's time. I have some early indicators when it's time. I think like when you go from like one to like five different teams working in parallel on the engineering side, you need suddenly a lot of alignment. That's where you can actually start applying process in terms of like, let's be intentional about planning. Let's be intentional about like what our goals we're trying to do. I'm intentionally saying goals, not OKRs, because I'm probably in the camp of like not like OKRs can kind of end up in a rabbit hole. Like we can take that rant in a bit, but really about like what are like helping the teams to prioritize and really framing it is through a lens of like let's focus on the work we have ahead of us and like what are the tangible things we can do. I'm definitely like my approach and how I try to operate is trying to reduce as little process as possible, but really like just trying to like kind of introduce the different levers we can kind of like look at, really focused on like how can we move like a particular goal forward, how can we help the team focus a bit more, that kind of thing. I definitely had my lessons. Like I've been working with teams where I literally been told to my face, "What the fuck are you doing here? Can you please just go away? You're making my life more hard." And I have other teams that is like early on say, "Oh, holy moly, this makes a ton of sense." Like actually really glad that we talk about like what we're trying to achieve for the quarter, that kind of thing. So I think it's all about the balance. And as a product leader myself, I'm still trying to figure out like that recipe. But definitely like when it comes to like coordination cost, when I'm seeing like the compound effect of that's just like cross communication, when velocity starts to drop, even though that you add more people, that's a lot of early indicators where you can kind of say, okay, now it's time to kind of like introduce this lever here. Let's do like an iteration cycle. Let's have a forum where we can talk about product strategy, those kind of mechanisms, right?
And you actually mentioned something that is uncommon, and that is being light on process. Because when we talk about instituting any kind of operational change, any kind of product cultural change, oftentimes you see leaders coming in and saying, you know what will fix everything? Process. Let's put
Right,
a process in
right.
place. Everybody, we're doing planning every 3 months. We're going to do this. And what happens is, because the culture is not really accounted for, and this kind of heavyweight thing is getting slapped on everyone. It's like, oh, you do planning this way. OKRs, like you mentioned, it's like, oh, we do OKRs now. And everybody's going to do OKRs. But without the kind of the cultural backing, that becomes more of a, I want to say, like, the incentives become reversed. Then you're not really caring about shipping a great product. You care about, like, well, how do I move this OKR? Because, and oftentimes what also happens is the OKRs are defined incorrectly. And then you end up with OKRs that are like, all right, are we actually moving the needle? Are we actually shipping a great product, or are we just like getting the number go up?
I definitely think what's the book about OKRs called Measure What Matters or
Measure what
something like
matters.
that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I definitely think like there's some truth in terms of like you get exactly what you try to measure, and as you have bigger organizations, when you define like specific KPIs and you align OKRs to that, like you get exactly that outcome, right? Like people have incentives and people will try to game the system. So that's why like maybe this is like the engineering me, but like look, think about my engineering background. The worst thing I could imagine was like sitting in a lot of meetings, having like some senior exec coming in applying processes on top of me, introducing new kind of tools, new kind of ceremonies, and how we should do things. I just wanted to like be able to do my craftsmanship, focus on the work, and really trust that I'm working on the most impactful things for the company. So like maybe that's kind of like the inner kind of engineering me I'm challenging. So like, how can I create that environment where people can focus on doing the best work without having minimal interruptions? And there's also some truth in terms of like the makers versus managers schedule, right? As a maker, as a contributor, you don't want to sit in meetings. You want to have focus and flow time and be creative and do other things. The worst thing is you want like a meeting with a PM at 1 and another one at 3, and then your day is done, right? So yeah, like I definitely think it's about a balance, but to me it's all about like how can you create that like visibility and transparency around, like does everyone know where we're going? Another kind of like I would say like mantra of mine is that everyone on the team should know the mission of what the team is trying to achieve. Everyone should know how like whatever how you measure the team or the business should know about how the business is going. If you're in a startup, everyone needs to know how much revenue we're doing, how many users we have into adoption, and what our satisfaction is. Everyone needs to know that, whether you're a designer, accountant, engineer, etc. And we also need to know how much runway we have left, because we're all in this together, right? So to me, there's also a lot of like creating that visibility, and also just making it clear that we focus on revenue, adoption, and satisfaction. Those are kind of my three buckets I kind of try to reduce things into. Yeah, it's definitely like I think like I'm a very atypical kind of PM in that regard. I think a lot of people have very elegant frameworks and can do elaborate Twitter threads, etc. I am not that kind of person. What I care about, exactly to your point, is like how can we together build the best possible product for our customers, and how do we ensure that we actually hear from our customers the other way, right?
I think that's one of the things that probably rubs me the wrong way when people talk about PM frameworks, because it's being seen as this kind of the end of it all. Like, if only we apply the right framework, then we'll reach product success. Oh, we need to do this 4x4 matrix and define, like, oh, you don't need any of that stuff. Just talk to your customers. Just figure out what your customers' pain points are and how to solve them. You don't need 7 matrices and pivot your board and read the 15th product management book on that framework.
I agree. I 100% agree. And also like I don't know how you feel like with your background and what you've been working on in the past, etc. But like, I'm probably looking at like you being a PM is that you kind of take a stint on like some functions in the team, and you morph into a different kind of role. We're all in this together, right? Some people just happen to write code, and I think like just throwing it out there, in the world where we have AIs like writing code for us, I think we're also going to see a lot of profound change what it means to be a software engineer, right? Like you probably need to be able to talk to your customers much more in the future when you have a lot of syntax being written for you. So it definitely is a very interesting kind of time. And I actually think like when hiring product managers, etc., like I think a lot of big companies, they're really focusing on that framework, right? It's like, can the candidate like use this framework? How do they measure success? Can they analyze data, etc.? But I think you end up with a lot of like candidates and a lot of PMs who can, it doesn't really matter what kind of product they work on. Like another failure mode I see in particular when you hire like very senior people, that it doesn't really matter whether they work on a developer platform or sausage factory. Is all about general management anyway, right? Like it's all about applying the same framework, do roll out the same processes. We all been reading like the first 90 days, and that's when you should start making changes. It's kind of the same recipe that is being rolled out. And I actually think that's a big mistake in the sense that I do think in particular, like as you kind of become more senior and you need to lead people, etc., that you need to have a strong opinion. You need to have like a point of view on where we're going, because your job is to kind of like rally the troops and create that like sense of alignment and camaraderie. So I really think like there's something about like you actually having a strong point of view is really, really important. And maybe I'm projecting my bias, but that's some of the people I work the best with, and some people that have strong opinions, loosely held. We will all course correct once we know more. But I'm inspired by working with other people that want to go somewhere, instead of like somebody that just want to move like a metrics 1%, and it doesn't really matter what I'm working on, right? So yeah.
I think it's a valuable thing to have in the leader, is that kind of boots on the ground mentality. Because as you move up in your career, things become blurrier kind of as you start looking into the details. And oftentimes exactly what happens is exactly what you described, is effectively a leader comes in, they're not really somebody that knows the product well, but they feel like, hey, it's management, right? Like I can put a process in. Back to the whole process soapbox. But and that's exactly what happens. And I think that there's inherent value in a leader having an in-depth understanding of what their teams are building, and most importantly, how their customers are using what their teams are building. Because if you're removed from customers, that's it. That's game over. Like if you don't understand what your customers are doing, that's like, why are you even doing this?
Yeah, exactly. And like you need to understand where your customer is going, where the market is going, where the industry is going. I think that's part of the core job. Naturally, you will have a team that can help you generate that point of view. You need to enable others to be able to lead and drive those things. But like you need to have an opinion. You need to understand what's going on. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're spot on with the assessment that it's not necessarily that the leader themselves needs to go and sit on the UX kind of research calls, but they have a team that brings them those insights and they understand those insights. Like
Yes.
they're not removed from it and just kind of, ruling by decree of saying like everybody's going to be doing this tomorrow. It's like, no, that's just not how a good team works.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. Like just thinking through my career, like doing engineering, now doing a product for a bit, now taking a break to kind of figure out what's kind of the next arc should be. It's definitely interesting to kind of see like I'm biased. I'm coming from like a startup background, but that first startup, I got my first job at. We went hardcore bankrupt. The investor lost all his money, so we had to close the company. I went to another startup. We just ended up selling that company, and it kind of went well from there. But like, I'm definitely like have like that bias towards actions. We need to do things, etc. If I had like come from like a more kind of, I would say like traditional kind of business background, and they've been doing like more corporate kind of jobs, I would probably have a very different approach of how I do things. But yeah, like just like to me, it's all about like what are you kind of building together, and having a strong opinion about that, right?
So I want to zero in on another part of your career, and that is investment, because I know that you've been dabbling in some of that. Uh, what kind of inspired you to go into that? Because it's not something that I hear a lot of people do, or a lot of people around me do. So what got you into investment?
Oh yeah, I'm a pretty active angel investor where I'm deploying some of my own hard-earned capital into to early stage companies. So I try to be like one of the first checks in pre-seed seed rounds, where I want to basically like pay it forward and help like accelerate the next generation of developer tools. So I have a little community of angel investors where we have people from like early startup companies that have like a bit of excess capital on the side, and we're just trying to pull together our resources. But really, like I think coming from like a startup background, I definitely been a big favor like the Silicon Valley mindset of paying it forward, in terms of like, can you help open the door for somebody else? Can you make the introduction? Can you really help accelerate an idea? And some of the most like successful people I've seen in my career and my network is people who have been able to do network, but also write a small check and tell them like, I believe in you. You should try to do that. So it's really just leaning into that kind of mantra of like, just trying to help the next founders. I think like angel investing is a very like, you should never do that if you want to make money. You should just put the money in the, like in SP 500 and then kind of like let it compound. So this is like basically a way for me to kind of like have a skin in the game, but also be working with with great tool makers and founders that they want to make new things happen. So yeah, like this is kind of like thing that just came naturally through the years in terms of like having people in my network work on things, having other people starting to write early stage checks, etc. So that's something I'm ramping up now and spending more time on. But to me, it's really about like how can we help the next generation of tool makers. And my mantra has been like software ate the world, but we still need like better developer tools. I still think like just like from an innovation perspective, it's kind of we stumbled into like object-based programming what in the 60s 70s, then kind of concluded that's what programming is like, and this is what an IDE should be like. And then we kind of just stopped really innovating. It's kind of the same kind of core concepts. And I definitely think we're in a very interesting time on our developer tools with the unlock we are now seeing provided by LLMs and models, etc. Is that I do think we're in a very kind of paradigm shifty time where like the way we're going to write code is kind of probably going to look quite different for a lot of developers like 5 to 10 years from now, even 3 years from now. So
How did you actually kind of dip your toes in investment? What started it all?
it started by one of my friends kind of breaking out and want to like do a company, and they were like, I want to do a company. I want to raise some money, and it's like, why don't I write you a check? And then we kind of got rolling. I also have a lot of peers and friends who have been doing very successful kind of companies and selling them. So I definitely been kind of introduced to kind of like deals, that kind of thing. And these days, I've kind of just been building out my network. So I have a lot of friends who now are VCs or angel investors, and kind of just building out that network, building out that trust when some companies want to like, or some people want to build a new company, etc. Like I'm getting introduced to them very early on, and I can either help them being introduced to like a proper VC firm, or I can introduce them to somebody else, etc. So it's definitely like I think angel investing and helping founders is all about networking and opening doors and trying to like kind of like the running joke for a lot of VCs, how can I be helpful, right? But to some degree, this is about like helping ideas become a reality in one way or another, right?
So for somebody that's probably listening to this podcast, the next natural question is, okay, great, I want to network. What's your recipe for good networking and building this trust over time?
Oh, isn't that like the answer to success of life or something, right? Like isn't like people that are really good at networking, good things happen to them. Um, I I don't know. I'm still trying to crack that knot. I have a background of like when I was based in Denmark, being part of the startup scene there. I ran a JavaScript meetup because I love JavaScript and was doing things. That's like one way of networking. That kind of evolved into me doing a conference. I ran a conference for a few years in Copenhagen. So that's kind of a natural extension of like, do we need to go to Berlin or London? Why can't we just fly people to Copenhagen and gather people? So over the years, we gathered like thousands of people. So that's definitely like one way I kind of like build out my capability to actually, instead of being an introverted person, to actually be extroverted and be able to network. I think like one of the things I'm doing here, like I'm based in New York City now, and I'm still fairly new to the city, been here a year, but I found like other like-minded people in the city, and kind of been more recently, we kind of been hosting a lot of events. Like we have been doing a DevTools and AI kind of drink up, where the first one we ran that actually in the Bay Area. The second one we ran that in Brooklyn. Then I've just been running like a Christmas edition here, kind of to end the holiday season. We've been doing one with Y Combinator. So we're just trying to lean into that and saying like, you know what, like if you facilitate something and you get people to show up, then you can kind of create a lot of like cross pollination. You can create a lot of magical moment. And I think the first one we did, we had a lot of great founders coming by. We had investors, other angel investors, professional VCs, etc. So it's all about like matchmaking in one way or another. But I think it's really about like to me, it's like that mindset of paying it forward. Is there somebody in your network you can help? If it takes like 5 minutes, you can open a door to somebody else. Then why not, right?
And it's very intentional, basically, right? Like it's not just about networking for the sake of networking. It's about, specifically as you described, like helping people and helping open doors.
Yeah, it's all about with that intention in mind. Naturally, like a lot of people have other intentions. If you are like an investor and you're out there hunting your next deal, you want to show up to these kind of things to do that. But like that's definitely not the mindset that I have. But I think like it's all about like why would somebody spend the time organizing a meetup in your city, right? Like it's all about like, to me it all comes down to like connecting people and just like fostering and curating great ideas, right?
I love it. How do you avoid burnout? You're doing so many things and you've done so many things before, right? Like balancing all of that, it's kind of, man, that sounds tricky.
Yeah, 100%. And I shall be honest, saying like there's probably times in my career where I have been pretty terrible at it. I remember like when I was working at Microsoft, for example, like working on VS Code in a tiny team was a very like long, hard job in the sense that we would kick off Monday morning in Redmond at 8 a.m. and I would probably be home by 8, right? It was like I didn't have a lot of energy to do that. Stripe is the same. Stripe was definitely not an easy company to work in. So there was a lot of things that I couldn't like do outside of my full day job just because I didn't have the mental bandwidth. Now I'm in a position where I'm taking a break from like full time employment. So that means naturally I have a lot of energy I can channel into other things. So definitely that's some of the things I'm trying to kind of ramp up. But I definitely think it's all about like also usually being intentional about how you balance things, right? It's like some people, for them the most important thing is to go for a long hike or like run a marathon a week. For me, it's all other things that I choose to prioritize. And I definitely think like you cannot do it all. But I'm trying to be intentional about doing these things. For me now, like I want to intentionally build my network, like help founders. So that's the thing I prioritize versus spending my time working full time being a product manager somewhere, right? So
This is a wonderful perspective. Now, we're getting to the part of our podcast that I ask of all of my guests, and that is, if you think of a piece of unconventional advice to somebody that is listening to this and they listen to our conversation and they think, wow, I want to build a career exactly as Kenneth does. Not necessarily, carbon copy of your career, but kind of inspired by your career. What would that unconventional advice be?
really spend a lot of time figuring out like what you're passionate about. I think a lot of us like end up on a hamster wheel where it's like, oh, I can go over here or I can do that, but then you end up realizing that when you're a few years in, it's like, wait, why did I take that job or why did I go over here, etc. And you realize you're not passionate about. So I guess like trying to identify that as soon as possible in terms of like what are you really passionate about. I think if you can kind of unlock that, then I think that kind of gives you a lot of focus, but also a lot more energy. I think like there's I can't remember like whether it was Sam Altman from OpenAI, etc. But he had a really interesting perspective. Somebody, I'll send you a link after. But like the perspective on like burnout, right? In terms of like a lot of people burn out because of they don't feel in control. They have a lot of demand, a high demanding job, maybe a manager they don't thrive with, etc. But they don't have control over the situation, so they end up burning out. But if you're passionate about something, normally you don't burn out in the same way. So you kind of just unlock unlimited energy because it's something that you cannot stop thinking about, etc. Where if you're in a situation where you don't have the control, you don't have the passion, then it kind of ends up being like a very negative kind of feedback loop. And I think definitely think that there's a lot of truth to that. Like the things I've been really passionate about that I really have genuine interest in, I cannot stop thinking about them, even though that I've been employed somewhere and it's probably not the best financial decision that my brain cannot stop thinking about it. Then that kind of unlocks a lot of energy. So really like trying to identify that as quickly as possible. And I guess like the other thing is like another thing is like there's also a difference in terms of like being nice to people and being kind to people. There's a difference in the sense that I think you can kind of be very superficial to people, but you can also doing the kind thing of like telling it the way it is. And whether that is like negative or positive, but I really think that there's a difference there in terms of like how you communicate with people. And at least in the way I try to build trust with a lot of people is just being kind and telling it like this is a pretty bad idea and you probably shouldn't be doing it, instead of just like sugarcoating it. That's another thing I'm trying to strive to, in particular here in North America. I know I'm European, so I'm probably a bit more like that directed than other people, but I think that's a lot of value, and then you just being genuine with people, regardless of what kind of situation you're in.
I can totally relate. As an Eastern European myself, it's one of kind of being direct and not sugarcoating is definitely one of those things that kind of, yeah, of course. You tell them it's the product sucks. This is the worst. I don't want to use it. But in the American society, that's not as well received, I want to say.
Yeah, actually on that front, me moving from Europe to North America has actually like forced me to really like recalibrate how I communicate and how I think about things. And it really took me like to be in some communication challenges with various episodes, but also like reading a few books. And one of the books I read was called The Culture Map, I believe. It's a kind of yellow front page. That was really eye-opening in terms of like just understanding cultural biases, but also how I am default wired by culture, where I happen to be born in the world versus where I am now. It's quite a big delta. So that was actually really just enlightening, and that's one of the books I recommend to anyone, in particular if you're managing like a remotely organization where people are distributed around the world. Just like read that book. That will help you to really understand like your team, but also yourself much better. Right?
I love it. What a note to wrap up the year and the season on. Kenneth, where can folks find you online if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
I'm pretty active on Twitter, so that's my last name at Auchenberg. I know it's a weird, complicated German name, and also like my website kenneth.io. So that's where you can kind of, you usually find me.
Excellent. And we'll make sure to include the links in the show notes. Kenneth, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.